The transition from the P-51 to the F-51 in 1948 was a bureaucratic shift that mirrored a change in military philosophy. The United States Air Force became its own independent branch in 1947, and by 1948, it decided to retire the pursuit category entirely. The Mustang was no longer just a plane meant to chase down other aircraft. It was now classified as a multi-purpose fighter, capable of ground attack and reconnaissance. In the immediate aftermath of 1945, the United States found itself with a massive surplus of aircraft that were expensive to store and maintain. Thousands of Mustangs were flown to desert bone yards like Kingman, Arizona, where they were lined up by the hundreds. Because the aluminum was more valuable than the airframes themselves at the time, many were fed into giant smelters to be recycled into consumer goods for the post-war housing and appliance boom. For those that weren't melted down, the government offered them to the civilian market. It was common for a veteran or a hobbyist to purchase a fully functional Mustang for about $1,500, which is roughly $22,000 in today's money. Many of these buyers weren't even interested in flying them. They often bought the planes just to drain the high-quality fuel or to harvest the powerful Merlin engines for use in high-speed racing boats. While the Mustang was still a pinnacle of propeller technology, the arrival of the P-80 Shooting Star and the rapid development of the F-86 Sabre made it clear that the future belonged to jet propulsion. Military planners initially believed the Mustang was obsolete for frontline combat. They transitioned the aircraft out of active duty and handed them over to Air National Guard units, essentially treating them as secondary equipment for part-time pilots, while the primary units transitioned to the much faster jet engines that could exceed 600 miles per hour. This move nearly ended the Mustang's military career prematurely until the outbreak of conflict in Korea proved that propeller planes still had a unique role to play. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the United States Air Force quickly realized that its shiny new jet fighters were not ideal for the specific conditions of the peninsula. The F-80 Shooting Star was fast, but it consumed fuel at an alarming rate and required long, paved runways that simply did not exist in the combat zones of Korea. Consequently, the military pulled hundreds of F-51 Mustangs out of storage and shifted them from Air National Guard units back to the front lines. The Mustang was not being asked to fight other planes in the clouds. Instead, it was redefined as a specialist in close air support, tasked with hitting enemy tanks, bridges, and troop concentrations at low altitudes. The logistical utility of the Mustang during this period was unmatched by any jet of the era. Because it used a propeller and had a rugged landing gear design, it could operate from rough, dirt strips located much closer to the shifting front lines. This proximity meant that a Mustang could stay over a target for several hours, a concept known as loiter time, whereas a jet might only have 15 minutes of combat time before needing to return to a distant base for fuel. Furthermore, the Mustang could carry a diverse and heavy ordnance load, including 5-inch rockets and napalm, which were devastatingly effective against ground targets in the mountainous Korean terrain. However, this transition to ground attack missions came at a high reality of physical risk. The Mustang was designed as a high-altitude interceptor, not an armored ground attack plane. Its cooling system was located on the belly of the aircraft, making it an easy target for even basic infantry rifles. A single well-placed bullet through the radiator would cause the engine to seize within minutes, often leaving the pilot with no choice but to bail out over enemy territory. Because of these low-level flight profiles and the intense concentration of North Korean and Chinese anti-aircraft fire, the Mustang suffered the highest loss rate of any aircraft type in the conflict. By the end of the war, nearly 200 pilots had been killed in F-51s, proving that while the plane was a vital workhorse, it was being used in a role that pushed its mechanical limits to the breaking point. Following the massive drawdown of the United States military after 1945, the government found itself with thousands of excess aircraft that were still mechanically sound but technically outdated for American jet age requirements. Through various mutual defense assistance programs, the United States began exporting these surplus Mustangs to more than 50 nations around the globe. For many of these countries, the F-51 provided an affordable entry point into modern aerial warfare. Australia and Canada utilized them for coastal defense and training, while the newly formed Israeli Air Force relied heavily on the Mustang during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and later in the 1956 Suez Crisis. In these theaters, the plane proved that its long-range capabilities and ease of maintenance were still valuable assets in regions where high-tech jet infrastructure had not yet been established. In Latin America, the Mustang had a particularly long and storied second life, often serving as the primary strike fighter for decades. Because these nations frequently dealt with internal insurgencies or border disputes in rugged, mountainous terrain, the low-speed precision of the Mustang was actually more practical than a fast jet. The most famous instance of this occurred during the 1969 conflict between El Salvador and Honduras, popularly known as the Football War. During this brief but intense struggle, P-51s were used by both sides in some of the last piston-engine dogfights in history. It was a surreal moment in military history, where a design from the early 1940s was still being used to settle national disputes nearly 30 years later. Back in the United States, the Mustang did not disappear from the skies immediately after the Korean War ended. It remained the backbone of many Air National Guard units throughout the 1950s. These units acted as a strategic reserve, ensuring that if a global conflict broke out, the country had a massive fleet of experienced pilots and proven aircraft ready for immediate deployment. It wasn't until 1957 that the last Mustang was officially retired from the Air National Guard, finally handing over the reins to the jet-powered F-86 Sabre and F-84 Thunderstreak. Even as it left official military hangars, the airframes were so plentiful and durable that they were quickly snatched up by civilian owners, beginning the aircraft's transition into the world of air racing and private collections. After the military began phasing out the Mustang, the aircraft found a second life in the high-stakes world of competitive air racing. The Reno Air Races, established in the early 1960s, became the premier stage for this transformation. Pilots and engineers treated the Mustang like a Formula One car, stripping away every ounce of unnecessary weight and modifying the airframes to handle extreme speeds. They often clipped the wings to reduce drag and tuned the Merlin engines to produce nearly double their original horsepower. Legendary racers like Dago Red and Voodoo eventually pushed the aircraft to speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, transforming a rugged soldier into a sleek, specialized athlete that dominated the unlimited class for decades. Beyond the race circuit, the Mustang was reimagined as a high-speed executive transport for the wealthy. During the 1950s and 60s, it was not uncommon for successful businessmen to want the fastest personal travel available. To accommodate this, the military hardware was removed, and the fuselage fuel tank behind the pilot was replaced with a second seat for a passenger. These civilian conversions featured plush leather interiors, soundproofing, and updated avionics, allowing an executive to fly between cities at speeds that far surpassed any civilian propeller plane of the era. It was the ultimate status symbol, combining the prestige of a war hero with the luxury of a private jet. A company called Cavalier Aircraft Corporation took this concept to a professional level. Founded by David Lindsay, Cavalier specialized in completely refurbishing surplus Mustangs into the Cavalier Mustang. These weren't just patched-up warbirds, they were essentially new aircraft. Cavalier stripped the planes to the bare metal, added a taller vertical tail for better stability, and installed wingtip fuel tanks to give the plane an incredible 2,000-mile range. The company's work was so respected that even the U.S. military eventually returned to them, ordering specialized military versions for export to Latin America and Asia. Cavalier even experimented with a turboprop version called the Turbo Mustang III, which eventually evolved into the Piper PA-48 Enforcer, showing that the Mustang's design was so robust it could theoretically keep up with the jet age. The change from P-51 to F-51 in 1948 was part of a major structural reorganization within the newly independent United States Air Force. For decades, the military had used the pursuit designation to describe aircraft intended to intercept and engage enemy bombers or fighters. By 1948, the Air Force decided that the term fighter was more accurate for the modern era, as these planes were increasingly expected to perform multi-role missions, including ground attack, tactical reconnaissance, and air superiority. This rebranding was not a mechanical upgrade, but a shift in how the military viewed the utility of its frontline aircraft. In the years immediately following 1945, the sheer volume of surplus aircraft created a massive logistical challenge. The United States had produced nearly 15,000 Mustangs during the war, and suddenly there was no mission for the majority of them. Massive storage depots became graveyards where the planes were stripped of their instruments and engines. The aluminum skin of the aircraft was often more valuable than the plane itself, leading to many being melted down to create raw materials for the post-war consumer boom. For civilians who wanted to fly them, the government set remarkably low prices, often selling airworthy Mustangs for $1,500. This led to a brief era where many former military pilots bought their own fighters just for weekend recreation or to use the high-octane fuels still sitting in the tanks. The rapid development of jet propulsion quickly made the Mustang feel like a relic of a previous era. The P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, could easily outpace the Mustang in level flight and at high altitudes. Military commanders realized that in a future conflict with a modernized enemy, a propeller-driven plane would be intercepted long before it could reach its target. This realization led to the Mustang being relegated to secondary roles and handed over to the Air National Guard. While the Mustang was still respected for its range and reliability, the tactical focus of the Air Force shifted entirely toward the sound barrier and the immense power of turbine engines. In the decades following its military retirement, the P-51 Mustang underwent a financial and cultural transformation that few other machines have ever experienced. What began as an unwanted surplus of metal sold off for roughly the price of a used car eventually became one of the most valuable and sought-after historic artifacts in the world. By the 1980s and 1990s, as the pool of original airframes began to shrink due to accidents and the simple passage of time, the Mustang moved from being a hobbyist's plane to a millionaire's investment. Today, a fully restored, airworthy Mustang can command prices between $2 million and $4.5 million. These costs are driven not just by the aircraft's rarity, only about 150 to 170 remain in flying condition, but the immense historical prestige and the specialized high-cost maintenance required to keep the legendary Merlin engines operational. This shift in value has turned the Mustang into the centerpiece of the modern warbird movement. Rather than being tucked away in static museum displays, these aircraft are kept in a perpetual readiness by dedicated collectors and foundations. This led to the creation of the Heritage Flight, a specialized program where civilian-owned Mustangs fly in tight formation with the United States Air Force's most advanced stealth fighters, like the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II. These flights are a deliberate effort to bridge the gap between generations, allowing the public to see the physical lineage of American air power. When a 1944 Mustang flies alongside a modern jet, it serves as a living classroom, demonstrating how the raw mechanical power of the past laid the foundation for the digital dominance of the present. The Mustang's legacy is ultimately defined by its endurance. It is a rare example of a weapon of war that successfully transitioned into a cultural icon. It remains the gold standard of the aviation world, representing a unique moment in history where engineering, aesthetics, and timing converge to create something that refuses to become obsolete. Even as aviation technology pushes toward undroned drones and space-age eads, the sight and sound of a P-51 Mustang remains the most evocative symbol of the era when the piston-engine fighter ruled the skies.